When we think of beauty, every era has its own strange rules. But the Middle Ages may surprise you the most. What we consider attractive today often had the opposite meaning centuries ago. One of the strangest ideals of medieval beauty was the preference for small breasts. Yes, in the eyes of nobles and poets of the time, a flat chest was not a flaw, but a mark of purity and nobility. Why? In medieval thought, the female body was more than flesh, it was a symbol of morality. Large breasts were often associated with lust, fertility, and even gluttony. They were linked to peasants, to women who worked in the fields, and to images of earthiness and sin. By contrast, small breasts suggested restraint, chastity, and refinement. A woman with a modest chest seemed untouched by desire, distant from temptation, and therefore more worthy of respect. Writers of the time praised this ideal openly. In courtly poetry, ladies were described with slender figures, narrow hips, and small, delicate chests. It was not about passion but about control. The less voluptuous a woman appeared, the more virtuous she was believed to be. This created a disturbing paradox. Women with naturally larger bodies were often shamed or ridiculed, while those with smaller forms were elevated as models of elegance. The female body became a battlefield of judgment, where biology itself could define whether a woman was seen as noble or corrupt. The church played a major role in this perception. Clerics often warned that excessive curves tempted men into sin. In sermons, physical fullness was tied to carnality, while thinness and flatness were linked to spiritual purity. Once again, beauty became morality, and morality became control. And for the women themselves, imagine the pressure. In a society where food was scarce, where survival was a struggle, having a fuller body might actually mean health. Yet the very sign of vitality was turned into a curse by fashion and belief. It is telling that medieval fashion also helped enforce this ideal. Heavy gowns, layers of fabric, and tightly bound bodices could flatten the figure, hiding curves and shaping the body into the narrow, lean silhouette admired at court. Clothes did not celebrate the body. They disguised it, suppressing what nature gave. In other words, medieval beauty demanded that women shrink themselves, literally. Small breasts were not just an aesthetic choice. They were a symbol of obedience, chastity, and control by the society around them. In the strange world of medieval beauty, almost nothing was left untouched. Women were judged not only for the size of their bodies, but also for the smallest details of their faces. And one of the most striking and to us bizarre standards was the obsession with the high forehead. Yes, in the courts of Europe, a broad, tall forehead was seen as the height of elegance. It was not enough to have smooth skin or fine hair. True nobility, people believed, could be read in the size of one's forehead. Why was this so important? In medieval thought, the forehead was more than a patch of skin. It was a symbol. A high, open forehead suggested wisdom, intelligence, and self-control. It meant you were thoughtful, virtuous, and refined. In other words, everything a noblewoman was expected to be. But what if nature had not given you this feature? The answer was simple and painful: you created it yourself. Noble women across Europe plucked, shaved, and even waxed their hairlines to raise the forehead as high as possible. Some went so far as to remove their eyebrows entirely, leaving their faces pale and bare. The process was far from glamorous. Imagine the sting of repeatedly pulling out hair, the redness and irritation, the awkward regrowth. Yet these sacrifices were considered necessary. To show a natural, lower hairline was to appear common, rustic, even animal-like. Only women of refinement bared their high foreheads proudly. Artists of the time reinforced this ideal. In portraits and illuminated manuscripts, noble ladies were painted with long, sloping foreheads, their hair pulled tightly back, their brows non-existent. These images spread the fashion further, setting a visual record of what beauty was supposed to look like. The irony is striking. Today, a full hairline and strong eyebrows are often celebrated as signs of health and vitality. But in the medieval mind, these features were blemishes to be removed. Beauty meant erasing, reducing, and conforming to an artificial image of perfection. There was also a deeper meaning hidden in this obsession. By removing hair, a natural sensual feature, women appeared more childlike, more controlled, and less sexual. Just like the preference for small breasts, the high forehead standard reinforced the idea that beauty equaled purity, modesty, and distance from desire. Once again, the female body was shaped to fit an ideal of obedience. Fashion, as always, helped enforce the look. Heavy headdresses, hoods, and veils framed the forehead like a stage, drawing attention to the smooth, hairless skin. The more bare and polished the forehead, the more it stood out beneath the elaborate headgear. Women literally put their sacrifices on display. And just as with every beauty standard, failure to comply could mean ridicule or shame. A woman with a low hairline might be mocked or dismissed as unfashionable. For noble women whose worth was tied to appearances, such judgments could affect marriage prospects, reputation, even survival at court. So, day by day, hair by hair, women reshaped their faces in pursuit of a standard that seems alien to us now. The pain, the effort, the time, all were offered up in service to a beauty ideal that valued symbol over self. It leaves us with a question. How many of these women truly believed they looked more beautiful, and how many simply obeyed the crushing pressure of society? Either way, the legacy remains. The portraits of medieval queens and noble women still gaze at us with their high foreheads and bare brows, silent witnesses to a time when beauty meant erasure. In every age, the color of skin has carried meaning. But in the Middle Ages, pale skin was not just a fashion choice. It was an obsession and one of the most dangerous beauty standards of all. To understand why, we need to step into the medieval mind. In a world where the majority of people worked outdoors, farming, herding, laboring under the sun, a tan was not a symbol of health or leisure. It was a mark of poverty. If your skin was darkened by the sun, it meant you belonged to the fields, to the peasantry, to the world of hard labor. By contrast, pale, almost ghostly skin became the mark of nobility. It declared to the world that you were wealthy enough to stay indoors, shielded from the sun, attended by servants. The whiter the skin, the higher the status. And so, women of the upper classes pursued paleness with fanatic devotion. But nature did not always cooperate. Not every woman was born with fair skin. And so, dangerous methods arose to force the body to fit the ideal. One of the most common was the use of lead-based cosmetics. Women applied powders and creams made with white lead, believing they gave the skin a porcelain glow. At first, the effect was striking. A smooth, chalky whiteness that covered blemishes and created an otherworldly look. But over time, the poison seeped into their bodies. Lead caused headaches, stomach pain, skin ulcers, and eventually organ failure. Some women literally died for the sake of pale skin. And lead was not the only danger. Other recipes called for vinegar mixed with chalk, or arsenic-based lotions, which could burn the skin and cause lasting damage. The more harmful the mixture, the more effective it seemed, at least in the short term. Pain, illness, and even death were accepted risks in the pursuit of beauty. Artists and poets reinforced the obsession. In love poems, noble ladies were described as white as lilies or pale as the moon. Paintings showed queens with smooth, ivory faces, their complexions so light they seemed to glow. The image of beauty became inseparable from the image of sickness, frail, untouchable, and ethereal. There was also a religious undertone. In Christian symbolism, whiteness represented purity, virginity, and spiritual perfection. A pale woman was not only beautiful. She was seen as closer to God, untouched by sin. Once again, the body became a tool of morality, and appearance became a form of control. But the reality beneath the powder was grim. Beneath the layers of toxic makeup, skin blistered and aged prematurely. Many women wore heavy veils or hats not only to protect from the sun, but also to hide the damage caused by the very substances meant to make them beautiful. Behind the facade of perfection was suffering. It is ironic that in a world so harsh, where disease and famine were constant threats, beauty demanded that women look as if they were already half dead. Pale, thin, fragile. This was the image that society celebrated, even as it destroyed the women who tried to achieve it. And yet, just like the high forehead or the small chest, pale skin was never truly about beauty alone. It was about power. It signaled wealth, class, and virtue. It drew a line between those who labored and those who ruled. It was another way to control women, to force them into molds created by men, tradition, and superstition. So the next time we see a medieval portrait of a queen with a ghostly face and vacant eyes, we must remember the truth. That whiteness was not natural. It was painted, poisoned, and purchased at a terrible cost. In our world today, full lips are celebrated. From red carpet celebrities to endless social media trends, a plump mouth is seen as a symbol of beauty, sensuality, and confidence. But in the Middle Ages, the exact opposite was true. For medieval society, the perfect mouth was not large or expressive. It was tiny, narrow, and almost invisible. A small mouth was praised as a sign of modesty, virtue, and self-control. By contrast, fuller lips were seen as vulgar, sinful, and dangerously seductive. The reasoning behind this strange standard is rooted in the morality of the time. To the medieval mind, everything about a woman's appearance was tied to her character. A small, tight mouth suggested chastity and discipline. It implied that a woman did not speak too much, did not laugh too loudly, and did not indulge in carnal desires. Large lips, on the other hand, carried heavy symbolism. They were linked to lust, temptation, and excess. Writers and clerics alike warned that women with fuller mouths were more likely to lead men into sin. Once again, beauty was less about appearance and more about control. How did women conform to this ideal? Fashion and cosmetics played a role. Women often darkened the edges of their lips or even used herbs and balms to shrink their appearance. Some paintings show ladies with lips painted in muted or darker tones, making them appear smaller and less defined. There was also the matter of behavior. In medieval etiquette, noble women were encouraged to hide their mouths when speaking or laughing. To expose one's teeth too much was considered crude, even animalistic. Women posed with closed mouths, lips pursed, and expressions subdued, an image of silent obedience. This ideal can be clearly seen in medieval art. Portraits of queens and noble ladies often depict them with delicate, nearly invisible lips. The emphasis is not on sensuality but on restraint. Their mouths are small, their smiles rare, and their beauty lies in what is concealed rather than revealed. The symbolism extended even further. A small mouth represented not only modesty but also silence. In a society where women were rarely allowed to hold power, speak freely, or command authority, the tiny mouth became a metaphor. To be beautiful was to be quiet. To be desirable was to be voiceless. The irony is almost painful. Women were judged harshly if their lips were too large, too red, or too noticeable. Yet they were also expected to inspire devotion and admiration. Beauty was turned into a paradox. Be admired, but not too much. Be seen, but not heard. And what of those who did not fit the mold? Just like with small breasts or high foreheads, deviation from the standard meant ridicule or suspicion. A woman with fuller lips might be whispered about as immoral, even if she lived a virtuous life. Gossip and superstition were as powerful as any physical feature. Once again, the body became a battlefield, where women were forced to shrink themselves, to hide, to erase what was natural. The small mouth ideal was not about lips at all, it was about obedience. It was another way to ensure that women remained controlled, their voices minimized, their individuality suppressed. Looking back, it is striking how deeply morality and fear shaped beauty. The tiniest detail, the shape of a woman's lips, became a symbol of her soul, her virtue, her worth. And yet, beneath the layers of control and judgment, the reality was simple. Women were being forced to disappear piece by piece, until only an image remained. When we think of medieval fashion, we often imagine flowing gowns, rich fabrics, and intricate embroidery. But behind those heavy layers of clothing was another strange standard of beauty. The desire for a body that was lean, narrow, and almost without curves. Unlike the Renaissance, which would later celebrate full-figured bodies as symbols of fertility and abundance, the Middle Ages often favored a very different look. A woman's body was not meant to draw attention to its natural form. Instead, it was supposed to appear long, flat, and restrained, more column than curve. Why? Once again, morality was at the heart of the standard. Curves were associated with sensuality, temptation, and physical desire. To show too much shape was to risk being labeled lustful or indecent. A leaner, straighter body, on the other hand, was seen as a sign of purity and modesty, qualities that medieval society valued above all in women. Fashion worked hard to enforce this ideal. Heavy gowns with multiple layers of fabric hid the natural lines of the body. Tight bodices compressed the chest, flattening any suggestion of fullness. Long vertical seams, belts, and stiff undergarments emphasized length rather than width. Even posture was affected. Women were encouraged to stand tall and still, their figures appearing more like statues than living beings. The result was an image of elegance that erased much of what we might today celebrate as beauty. In medieval eyes, the less the female form revealed, the more virtuous it appeared. To conceal the body was to control it, and to control it was to make it acceptable. This standard created a striking contradiction. On the one hand, noble women were expected to display wealth and status through their clothing, with expensive fabrics, jewels, and embroidery. On the other hand, their actual bodies were supposed to remain invisible beneath it all. The woman herself disappeared, replaced by the gown, the fashion, the symbol. And, as always, the church reinforced the message. Clerics preached against vanity and sensuality, warning women that their bodies were snares for men's souls. The straighter, plainer silhouette became a way to demonstrate piety, humility, and obedience. Once again, beauty and morality were bound together. But for women, the reality was suffocating. Literally, tight lacing and restrictive clothing made breathing and movement difficult. Heat and weight made daily life uncomfortable. Yet these sacrifices were demanded, all to project an image of virtue shaped not by women themselves, but by the men and institutions that judged them. It is important to note that these ideals were not universal. In some regions, and at some points in time, fuller figures were admired. But in much of medieval Europe, especially among the upper classes, the trend toward leanness and restraint dominated. And as with every other beauty standard, failure to conform carried social consequences. A woman who appeared too curvy, too sensual, risked being shamed, excluded, or reduced to dangerous stereotypes. In the end, the lean body ideal was never really about health or attractiveness. It was about control, about making women smaller, quieter, less visible, about shaping them into symbols of chastity, rather than allowing them to exist as individuals. The irony is that, while women suffered under these heavy gowns and restrictive ideals, men wrote poems and songs praising their graceful forms and elegant lines, never acknowledging the cost behind the image. Once again, beauty was a prison. A woman's body was bound, hidden, and judged not for what it was, but for how well it conformed to a standard created by others. By now, we have seen how the Middle Ages shaped beauty through control. Small breasts, high foreheads, pale skin, tiny mouths, and lean bodies. But the story does not end there. Even the smallest details, teeth and scent, became part of the strange and unsettling picture of what it meant to be beautiful. Let us begin with the smile. Today, we are surrounded by advertisements for bright, white teeth. A shining smile is marketed as the universal sign of health and attractiveness. But in much of the medieval world, white teeth were not the ideal at all. In fact, some cultures in the Middle Ages admired blackened teeth. In parts of Asia, for example, women stained their teeth with dark dyes, a practice that symbolized maturity and status. In Europe, meanwhile, whiteness was not always emphasized. Nobles sometimes decorated their teeth with gold coverings or inlaid designs, turning the mouth into a display of wealth rather than natural health. What mattered was not the color itself, but the message it sent. Beauty was luxury, and luxury was power. Of course, for most people, dental hygiene was poor. Tooth decay was common, and missing teeth were almost normal. To hide this, women were encouraged to keep their smiles subdued. Once again, the tiny mouth ideal fit neatly into the culture. A closed mouth meant fewer chances to reveal the flaws within. But teeth were only part of the picture. Another crucial element of beauty was scent. In an age when daily bathing was rare, the human body carried strong odors. For peasants, this was unavoidable. For nobles, it was unacceptable. And so, perfumes became not just accessories, but necessities. The ingredients used were strange by modern standards. Musk came from animals. Ambergris, one of the most prized substances, came from the intestines of whales. Civet was extracted from cats. These exotic and often unpleasant raw materials were transformed into rich perfumes that masked the natural smell of the body. But perfumes were more than practical. They were symbolic. Sweet smells were associated with virtue and holiness, while foul odors were linked to sin and corruption. To smell good was to appear pure, elevated, and desirable. To smell bad was to risk being judged immoral, dirty, or cursed. And so, beauty in the Middle Ages was layered upon layer. Painted skin, plucked hairlines, compressed bodies, subdued lips, disguised teeth, perfumed air. Each element carried meaning, and together they formed a standard that was less about attraction and more about power, control, and status. It is striking to realize how much suffering was hidden beneath these ideals. Women poisoned their skin with lead, endured pain from plucking and tight clothing, hid their voices, their curves, even their smiles, all to fit into a mold that society had declared beautiful. But in the end, what we see in these strange standards is not only oppression. We also see the creativity, resilience, and endurance of women who lived within them. Despite the restrictions, many noble women found ways to use fashion and beauty to express themselves, to claim influence at court, and even to turn these ideals to their advantage. Beauty was a prison, yes, but sometimes it was also a tool. Today, the standards have changed, but the story remains familiar. Every generation invents its own impossible ideals, and every society tells women how they should look. The Middle Ages remind us that beauty has always been about more than appearance. It is about power, about who defines the rules, and about who suffers because of them. So the next time we see a medieval portrait of a pale queen with a high forehead, narrow body, tiny mouth, and hidden smile, we should remember the truth. Beneath the paint and perfume was a woman, judged, controlled, and shaped by forces far beyond her own desires. And that is the final lesson of medieval beauty, that every ideal tells us less about beauty itself, and more about the society that created it.